Hello, gang. Tattooed Biker here, and welcome back to Weird Wednesdays, where I explore the unexplained and dive deep into all kinds of mysterious encounters and experiences. Tonight, I have something truly intriguing lined up for you. I've received two of the strangest and most captivating Bigfoot encounters that I've read in a long time now, and I'm excited to share them with you. So get ready, kick back, and enjoy the ride into the unexplained. Number 1. Dear Tattooed Biker, I had a weird encounter that I'd like to share with you. It happened in late August 2022, and I was fishing on Cold Lake, right on the border between Alberta and Saskatchewan. Had one of my most productive fishing days ever there, and kept a few walleye to cook for dinner. Since I brought the tags for them, I tented on the north end of the lake, east of the North Bay cabin, since I don't really like campgrounds much. It was probably around 5 or 6 p.m. when I set up camp and got the fire going. I do remember that I still fished from the bank for an hour or so before I eventually got dinner started. During that period is when I remember first hearing a lot more noises out of the tree line than before. Not anything out of the ordinary, mostly just birds and the occasional squirrel. But eventually I started to get the feeling that something was watching me, which actually got me a bit more worried than I'd usually be, as my first thought was a cougar. I know what it feels like to be watched by one. It's uncomfortable, to say the absolute least, and a terrifyingly surreal experience at worst. Each time I looked back, there wasn't anything watching me that I could see. Eventually, I lost interest and began supper, which is when the sounds of the forest stopped suddenly. Things felt cold and dead. The forest felt dead. Now, even more on guard about a possible cougar or bear, I moved away from the tree line and closer to the shore, as there was a bit of flat ground forming almost like a beach. I didn't have a firearm at the time, but I did have a can of bear spray on my chest, which I moved into my hand. There still wasn't anything visible through the tree line, but the faint sound of what could be footsteps cut through the silence of the forest. In all reality, it was less footsteps and more the sound of an animal moving through the brush that I heard. Weirdly enough, it sort of relaxed me, as a cougar probably wouldn't be so carelessly loud. At least it did for the moment. Aware that I was rather vulnerable in my position, I did begin packing up my stuff. Thankfully, my tent wasn't set up yet. Back into my bag and got near the kayak. What I saw when I looked back up at the tree line, not even 20 feet in front of me, however, was likely the most terrifying, yet uniquely beautiful moment of my life. Standing upright, half behind a tree, was a tall, maybe 7 feet tall, dark humanoid thing. Vaguely like a Sasquatch, but much thinner, closer to the proportions of a human, covered in reddish-brown hair fur. All I could see was its body above the waist, though its arms seemed to extend further down. I couldn't make out many features, though the eyes appeared vaguely yellowish. Oddly enough, after the initial shock wore off, it didn't seem threatening. If anything, I want to say it was maybe curious. What I'm about to say next defies all common logic and all human reason, but as someone standing face to face with what could have been death itself, I raised my arm in the air. The best way I could describe this scene is if anybody has ever watched The Fantastic Mr. Fox. The scene at the end with the wolf. That's the closest thing that I know to compare it to. The creature didn't come any closer, nor did it make a sound, but instead oddly attempted to mimic me, raising its long, thin arm in the air before setting it back down and walking calmly back into the tree line. What I saw that day, the creature that I witnessed, led me to reevaluate my opinions towards these animals. that maybe they aren't just animals. These are intelligent creatures, and the time it took to kayak back to civilization, immediately afterwards, and the time since then, has only reaffirmed my belief in that. Of all the encounters people have had with what could be a Sasquatch, I'm glad mine became an almost positive memory. Hopefully, this was a sufficient enough letter. I apologize for the length. I probably could have trimmed it down a bit, but my goal was to try and allow you to imagine it fully, trivial details and all. Whatever I saw that day left an impression on me. Human, Sasquatch, whatever. Anyway, thanks for reading. Always, B. Number 2. Dear Tattooed Biker, I have a story for you. On the day that it happened, I was hiking on a small trail alongside a stream off of a forest road in Lasan National Forest in northeastern California. There were a couple of cars along the road, so I thought it would be a safe place for me to hop onto a small trail. I like to hike in some odd places, practicing my navigation skills with a map and a compass and my phone GPS app tracking my path. I like to pinpoint some unique land features on a topo map and then go find them. I usually go with a group of orienteering friends, but that day I was hiking solo. When I'm alone, I don't go very far into the forest. However, the events of that day drove me deep into the woods. The stream was rather small compared to the actual stream bed, which was odd, considering there had been a decent snowfall over the winter. I also noticed that there was a lot of algae in this stream, and a quarter-mile in I could smell rotting trout long before I came upon it. There were pieces of trash littered along the stream. I also came across a few dead animals near the stream as I walked along the trail. It was disgusting, but I assume this is a popular area with teens or target shooters. Maybe they left some trash behind. I didn't know what these were the warning signs of what I was walking into. About a mile in, the trail diverged from the stream and I cut through the shrubs and trees. I was close to my destination, a spot along the stream that looked like it could possibly have a small waterfall. The trail turned left and it opened up into a large, flat clearing. I stopped immediately, looking across the clearing, and there was trash everywhere. And there were rows of cultivated dirt, but the plants were all uprooted. There was a holding pond lined with plastic sheeting along the stream, and there was a pile of sports drink bottles, filled with a milky pink fluid next to it. Along the edges of the garden were what looked like homemade spike strips, boards with nails driven through them. I could smell the distinct odor of marijuana in the air. This was an illegal grow site. I had seen enough news reports about what happens to people who come across these that made me know that I needed to get away from there fast. I turned and ran into the shrubs on the opposite side of the trail. Hiding behind a crumbling tree stump, I checked my map to make sure I was heading into uneven terrain where I would be unlikely to find another garden. The cars at the trailhead likely belonged to whoever was maintaining this garden, but since they weren't at the location, they were probably at another. I started to stand up, but dropped back down, holding my position when I heard a pair of male voices speaking in Spanish. I recognized a few words like mountain and up when they were talking, and they kept repeating grande, grande. When their voices faded away, I quietly started to go in the opposite direction, putting some distance between me and them. The map indicated that if I kept going east, there were no streams, and there would be some decent elevation changes. But afterward, there was a forest road I could follow. I walked straight through, maintaining an eastbound path for half an hour, until I heard a soft wailing sound coming from the left of me. I stopped dead in my tracks. It sounded like nothing I'd heard in the forest before. It didn't sound like an animal. It sounded human. I could also smell a strange odor in the air, and I noticed some long tracks on the ground that looked like a bear double step, but one side had splotchy blood in it. I grabbed my bear spray and knife out of my bag and stood still, looking around for the source of the noise. I took a couple of steps forward and then everything went silent. Suddenly, I felt something crash into my left side from the rear, knocking me to the ground. I looked up, terrified that it was a bear, but it looked like a massive man, covered in dirty blonde hair and very tan skin. He grunted at me and then collapsed on the ground. His feet, near my face, I could see a massive gash on the sole of his foot, with pine needles and dirt sticking to the blood that was oozing from it. I heard voices coming from the direction I had just come from. I wasn't sure if it was the same men, but I didn't want to risk it. I jumped up on my feet and smacked his leg and said, "Go," as loud as I dared. I started running east, and I heard his limping footsteps pounding on the ground, heading slightly north of me. There was a hill ahead with several large boulders that I could somewhat see through the thick trees. I continued running until I reached it. I climbed up the hill and I could smell that weird odor again. I followed the odor and found the hairy man collapsed on his back on the ground. He was taking short, rapid breaths, and I could see that he had 2 holes in the far right side of his chest where the blood was oozing. He looked human, and yet he didn't. He looked like he could kill me single-handedly, but I had an overwhelming urge to help him. I knelt down beside him and grabbed his massive hand to try and check for his pulse. I could feel a strong beating under his skin, giving me hope. He looked at me with eyes that seemed to ask for my help. I pulled the first aid kit out of my pack and looked at what I had, trying to figure out the best way to make what I had work. I keep my day kit light, carrying only things that will patch me up enough to get help. I only had 2 hemostatic gauze pads. The chest wounds were the most concerning. I put my ear near the wounds, listening for sucking sounds, then applied the gauze when I heard none. I applied pressure for several minutes and then ripped 2 pieces of tape off the roll to hold them there. His eyes were slightly open and watching me as I gestured for him to open his mouth. He closed his eyes with his mouth still shut. He could have indicated to me by now if he didn't want me touching him, so I just went for it. I carefully pulled open his mouth to check his gums and tongue, keeping my fingers clear in case he decided to snap his mouth closed. His gums were dark, but his tongue was pink. I didn't see any signs that his lungs had been punctured, but when I looked at his teeth, they weren't quite like a human's. His canines were larger, but not as oversized as a gorilla's. Once the critical injury was dressed, I went down to work on his foot. Washing it gently with some water from my pack, he lifted his head up and looking at me all the time, but he didn't jerk his foot away. I did my best, trying to clean it out using one of my maxi pads to wipe away the debris and dry the skin. The cut was long, nearly 1 inch deep across most of it, and there was a hole in the very top of his foot as well. His foot was very broad and flat, and the wound was trying to splay open. I filled the cut with ointment and used the tape to make some massive butterfly strips to pull the 2 sides of the wound together, leaving drainage gaps between the strips. I left the hole on top uncovered to serve as a drain as well. I then took my last maxi pad and strapped it to the bottom of his foot like a sandal, using the tape across the top. I looked back up at his face and I could see a small trickle of blood running on the ground by his head. I had missed a wound someplace. I went back to his side and pulled on his arm, hoping he would get the idea to roll over. He was far too heavy for me to pull over without his help. Finally, I got him to roll onto his side, and I found 2 jagged exit wounds on his back about the size of my thumb. I didn't have much left in my first aid kit, but I did have several tampons. I opened up the tampon package and put the applicator in about an inch deep and inserted it, leaving about a third of it outside his body. I repeated this in the other hole and then pulled on his arm to get him back on his back to keep pressure on the tampons. Once he was flat again, he closed his eyes and his breathing slowed down. He seemed to be sleeping. I stayed there watching him for a few minutes and cleaning up my trash when I heard shots off in the distance. I needed to get down to where I could find help, but I couldn't leave him exposed. My cell phone didn't have service at this point, so I needed to get back down to the road. I didn't think it was likely that whoever was shooting the gun would come up the hill, but I gathered up a few branches I could find and covered him with them, hoping he would stay sleeping until I came back. I started down the hill on the eastern side, headed toward the forest road. Once I hit the flat dirt, I ran south until I saw a truck headed down the road towards me. I could see the light bar on top, and I was so relieved at that point. I knew I was safe. The ranger pulled up to me, and I broke down. I knew I couldn't come right out and say that I'd seen a Sasquatch. So instead, I told the ranger about the illegal grow and said that I saw a severely wounded bear with young cubs they had shot. It was a lie, but I needed him to go back with me and check on him. And he probably wouldn't believe me if I said what he really was. We drove back to the hill and we ascended where I had hit him. The ranger was following close behind me with his gun drawn. The ranger wanted me to follow behind, but I wanted to make sure that I was the first face the Sasquatch saw. He likely wouldn't survive another gunshot wound, and if he slammed into the ranger, as he did to me, the ranger would likely shot him. When I was able to see the top of the hill, I could see the branches, but he was gone. The blood from his back was still there, but the branches I'd covered him with were arranged into an X on the ground. It's been 6 years since that day, but it feels like it was yesterday. Since I didn't see him get his injuries, I'll never know for certain what had happened. I've read stories about them being protectors of the forest, and I think that's what he was doing. These illegal growers divert water from streams to grow, and their camping garbage brings a lot of wildlife to their gardens. Then they use highly potent and sometimes illegal rodenticides and insecticides, and large die-offs are common around grow sites. Everything from birds to bears. It would make sense that he would want to push them out of his forest. I'm certain he was shot, and I think when he was running away he stepped on a spike strip and it ripped through his foot. I did my very best to take care of him, and I wish I knew he was okay out there. Thanks for taking the time to read this. Signed, R. And there it is. All I have for tonight, and I hope you enjoyed these bizarre Bigfoot encounters with me today. Remember, the truth can be stranger than fiction, and mysteries that surround us continue to captivate our imaginations. If you have any encounters or stories to share, let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed the content, please take a moment to like the video and consider subscribing. It's completely free and it really helps out the channel. So until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant, stay safe, and I'll be seeing you on down the road a ways. Biker out.